Okay. Your book records the second way, which has to do with efficient causes. I have 4 of the 5 ways in this. And basically, they're not all cosmological arguments. Your author is a little careless there. The first 3 of them are. The 4th, we're not going to worry about. The 5th is a version of the teleological or design argument. But so I want to look at these, because the first 3, even though your book only has 1 of them, and we didn't do Aristotle's 4 causes. Maybe I should have, but so we saw that he's influenced by Aristotle and wants to synthesize Christian views with Aristotle, reason and revelation. And all of his arguments are a posteriori. They depend on observations about the world around us to get them started. And this first version really is a modification of Aristotle's original proof of the existence of his impersonal version of God, the prime mover. The prime mover was supposedly pure actuality, no potentiality. Even today, we use similar language when we talk about potential energy and kinetic energy, right? I mean, there's potential energy if something's sitting, if you knock it off and it's in motion, it's kinetic energy. But one way of conceiving of motion is that it goes from potentiality to actuality. And these are some of Aquinas' own examples. In other words, wood would be potentially hot, but if you set it on fire, it's actually hot. So Aristotle distinguishes between something that's merely potential and something that's actual. But Aquinas tries to say that a thing can't bring itself into existence because it would have to be potential and actual at the same time. In other words, he says things are one or the other. Wood is either actually hot or it's potentially hot, but for Aquinas and Aristotle, there's no middle ground. And this is an actual illustration he uses. So he says a thing can't cause itself because it would have to move itself, it has to be in potential motion, but to be a mover, it has to be an actual motion. And so for Aristotle, there had to be a prime mover who's nothing but pure actuality is his term. So a thing can't move itself because to move itself, it would have to be both actually and potentially moved at the same time. Right? It has to be actual to be the initiator of motion, and it has to be potential to be moved. So he says there's a contradiction in assuming that things bring themselves into existence or into motion. So he says whatever is moved has to be moved by something else. And now, all of these arguments basically depend on a kind of a causal chain going back to the beginning, right? In other words, we say, okay, hey, right now, things do set one another in motion, and some things are in motion. And they didn't set themselves in motion, though there had to be a prior cause of that motion. But now, what Aquinas tries to say is we can't follow this infinite series back to infinity. Now, a thing your book neglects to mention, but you'll recall, if you, where is the first member of an infinite series? And you say, wait a second, Mr. Morawski, that's a trick question, isn't it? Because an infinite series has no first member, right? So he says, so he has to show that this process can't go back to infinity. Now, he has the same move in his other ones, and some people think, well, isn't this kind of begging the question, kind of assuming what you're supposed to be proved? Because he says, essentially, well, we can't have an infinite series because there would be no first member. Now he does make a more salient point, basically in his second way, where he's talking about efficient causes. He says, well, there had to be a first cause because then there wouldn't be any intermediate causes or any causes of what we have today. So he says, if the process were infinite, then there wouldn't be any first mover. In other words, does he beg the question? Does he say, well, hey, if the process were infinite, there wouldn't be any first mover, so it can't be infinite. There must be a first mover. Well, of course somebody can say, well, why couldn't it just be infinite? And this debate about the possible infinity of the universe, believe it or not, goes on today in cosmology. Just when you think it's been shot down, it rises again. But he says there wouldn't be any subsequent movers down the chain. So he says you need a first mover to set the intermediate causes into effect to ultimately cause what we see around us today. So if there were no first mover, there wouldn't be any intermediate causes down the chain, and we wouldn't have what we have today. So he says there had to have been a first mover. And I didn't put the arrow in this, but of course, Aquinas says, well, that first mover, and here's where he's combining faith and reason. Here's where he's combining the abstract philosophical argument with what he believes based on, the Bible and church tradition. Because for him, that first mover is not Aristotle's aloof, impersonal God who could care less about the universe and perceives only his own perfection, but the personal God of the Bible and church tradition who's involved in the lives of human beings. So he says, well, who would this first mover be then but God? So he's trying to say that in order to have what we have today, we had to have a whole series of things setting other things in motion, going up to what we have today, but there had to have been a first cause of all that motion. And for Aristotle, that was the prime mover. For Aquinas, he says, well, it's the God of the Bible and church tradition. Now, the second way is what's quoted in your text, and it's a very clear version. You know, Aristotle had several causes, but what Aristotle calls efficient causes are basically what we recognize today as causes. Some of Aristotle's other causes, like final causes and formal causes, in other words, for Aristotle, part of the explanation of why the acorn ultimately becomes an oak tree is that there's a teleological cause, a final cause, pulling that acorn in its development toward that final end of becoming an oak tree. Now, after Sir Isaac Newton, we tend to think of nature as not imbued with purposes, like Aristotle and Aquinas thought, but as a totally mechanical system where the only real causes that are operating are what we now today call efficient causes. Aristotle had these, but he had other types of causes as well. So we don't see these built-in purposes in the way that Aristotle and Aquinas did. So an efficient cause brings its effect into existence, produces its effect. So here again, this argument gets off the ground as an a posteriori argument. It gets off the ground by observing the world around us and saying, hey, things cause other things, right? I had to put my coffee pot over the gas stove. I'm kind of traditional, to heat water for coffee this morning. So you go from the fact that, okay, observations tell us that things cause other things. Now, here he has a similar argument. In other words, he has to show that things didn't cause themselves. They didn't bring themselves into existence. Efficient causes perceive their effects in time. Right, the cue ball. The cue stick has to first make contact with the cue ball before it starts rolling. And so here again he says we'd run into the same kind of contradiction if we assume that things produce themselves, if we assume that things were the efficient cause of themselves, because for them to, if an efficient cause perceives its effect in time, then you would run into the absurdity that for a thing to be the efficient cause of its own existence, to bring itself into existence, it would have to exist before it exists. It would have to precede its own existence in time, which is an outright contradiction. So you say, well, okay, we eliminate that possibility. Basically, the overall structure of this argument is what logicians call a disjunctive argument or a disjunctive syllogism. And it's the same kind of reasoning that your doctor uses in diagnosing something, or that a mechanic or a computer technician uses. You say, okay, here's a phenomenon, here's something I got to explain. The causes are either A or B or C. Now let me eliminate some of them. And so this is kind of where in other words, he's saying, well, here we have a phenomenon. Things cause one another. Well, A, they're either the efficient cause of themselves. B, everything, the universe is just infinite, which is where he's going next. Or C, they needed some first cause to get everything going and produce stuff. And so he's going to say, well, it ain't A, because things would have to exist before themselves. So things didn't bring themselves into existence. And here again, he's going to try to say we can't have an infinite series of efficient causes. And so he's going to say, well, it's not B either. So the option left is C, namely there had to be a first cause of all things. And who would that first cause be but God himself? So he says it's impossible that something brings itself into existence. But now he's got to eliminate the next option, that everything just goes back to infinity and there isn't any first cause. So here again, he says, and he makes it a little clearer in the second way, he says you had to have a first cause to, that's what FC stands for, if you haven't guessed, to create the intermediate causes in the causal chain to produce, well, I say ultimate cause, but really it's the ultimate effect. The ultimate effect would be what we see around us now. So he's saying if you didn't have any first member of the series, you wouldn't have any intermediate causes, and you wouldn't have what we have today. So we had to assume that there was a first member of the series, and the series did not go to infinity. Okay, let's see, I think. So, again, he says you take away the cause, you take away the effect. So if you take away the first cause, then there are no intermediate causes and no ultimate cause. So efficient causes can't go back to infinity. Hence, there needs to be a first cause. So he says basically things can't be the efficient causes themselves. Let's eliminate the A option. Things can't go back to infinity, so we don't need a first cause. Let's eliminate the B option. The only option left is C, namely there had to have been a first cause of all things, namely God. And we'll look a little bit. I'm not going to dwell on the third way because actually it's the most complicated of it. But I do want to pass out a copy of this, and it's due for your class November 19th. Okay. And again, we're talking a minimum of 500 words. Most of them, though, are going to be around 4 or 5 pages, which is a bit more than 500 words. But this is the assignment, and I will post it online, for the critical reflection paper. And look, the pages here are suggestions. You might look at them. Basically what they are is places in your text, and I'm not real satisfied with the discussion of these topics in your text. It's very sketchy. And for some of these, if you want some suggestions, I can give, that should be 2. I can give you some. But basically, you can do some research if you want to, but it's not necessarily, it's what the purpose of the assignment is to get you to reflect back on some things that we covered in the course or some things that we read, and to try to look, I mean, I've had some students sweat blood over this and say, well, my God, I know what a term paper is. I had English. They taught me how to write a term paper, but I don't know what a critical reflection paper is. Tell me. Well, basically, it's no different from a term paper where you're basically trying to analyze something. You're trying to get out somebody's arguments in favor of something and your point of view. Now, some of these I don't have pages for, but I redid this from a list that I used to use that was more straightforward but blander. If you read over these, you'll see that I phrase them in a kind of controversial way, and that's on purpose because I think sometimes, again, no, what I say is either agree with or challenge one of these statements. In other words, sometimes our best papers are written because we're reacting to something that we say, how can they say that? I got to write something against that, and so, you might want to take a view that you agree with and that reinforces your own beliefs on a subject, or you might want to challenge something. And I may give you some other additional sources, but again, this is not, you can see it's relatively short, basically 3 to 5 pages. So it isn't like this is a huge research paper where we want to see 10 sources, I mean, you don't have time for that. So pick a topic, but again, look at those pages, but maybe not every page is one that's going to be useful to you. But these are page references of some of the philosophers that your text touches on who have said things that are relevant to the question. Okay? So, I've redone this assignment for different texts. And so I redid it for yours, but yours is kind of sketchy on things, so, but see what you can. If somebody wants some suggestions, I can give you some suggestions too. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to finish Aquinas. I want to talk just a little bit about some of the more contemporary versions of the argument that they covered there. The final way is what is called, is a version of the design argument. So we're going to look at the two other ways and maybe go into a little bit of the discussion of the problem of universals. We'll see how far we get on Wednesday. Look, let me mention this. There's still, remember I said a few weeks ago there's an outside chance I may have to go out of town. There's a possibility that Wednesday that might happen, and I may not. So if you see no message on Blackboard, assume everything's fine, is copacetic, we're meeting as usual. But do yourself a favor and either late Tuesday or early Wednesday, try to check Blackboard and see if
like our messages, or there'll be an announcement?
Yes.
well, there'll be an announcement, okay, there is a function that also lets me send the announcement to whatever email address you gave, so I may do both. But I just want to alert you to the fact, I think we're going to meet as normal on Wednesday, but there is the chance that I may have to go out of town just for the day. And again, it's frustrating that I may not know something till much later today or Tuesday. So So, definitely do yourself a favor and check late Tuesday or early, Wednesday morning to see if there's an announcement on Blackboard, because there's some chance that we won't have a meeting. Okay. Well, look. Thanks. I would ask folks, and look, it's try to get here a little bit closer to the starting time, because it's sometimes, it's a little harder to try to start a class when we only have 3 people sitting there at 8 o'clock. I'm glad to see all of you, but, in a class of 25, if you're not there, it's not as noticeable. In a class of 11, it is. But, so thank you. I'd appreciate it if you could make a little extra effort to get here closer to the starting time. See you all. So check Blackboard Wednesday.